Hi, Charles SirBookSage here, and this is my review of Bob Dylan Chronicles Volume 1, his memoir about coming to New York City in 1961 to break into the folk music scene. Now, I absolutely loved every single moment of this book. Dylan is my favorite songwriter. The Beatles are my favorite band, but Dylan is my favorite lyricist, my favorite songwriter. I grew up, the first music I ever heard really were the Beatles and Bob Dylan and a few other people. My father actually had bought each of like the first 5 Dylan albums. I still have them in my what's left of my vinyl collection, stuck in a closet somewhere in the house. But so this was a thrill for me to read, and I'm from New York City as well. So the places he talks about here, mainly McDougal Street in the West Village, is where the bulk of the book takes place. And me and my friends hung out in McDougal Street in the 80s and 90s. So it's fascinating to see places that I know very, very well that I've been in, and what they were like back in 1961. And a really, really interesting book. Now, one of the things I did here, and I would suggest if you're interested in reading about Dylan's time coming to the city to break into the music industry, is go to YouTube and listen to Bob Dylan's 2016 Nobel lecture in literature. Because he won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2016. And in 2017, he published his lecture, because when you win, you have to give a speech. And the first half of the lecture is him talking about folk music and learning about it and immersing himself in that world and wanting to learn every little nuance of every different performer and to be able to emulate them and do what they do. And the second half of the video is him basically doing a book review of Moby Dick, All Quiet on the Western Front, and The Odyssey. So if you ever wondered what Bob Dylan would be like as a booktuber, you get a taste of that in the second half of the lecture. And really fascinating lecture. And one of the reasons I mentioned listening to that before you read this book is 2 reasons. One, the first half of the lecture is a good little primer and introduction into what you're going to get into more detail in here in this book. And 2, just listening to Bob Dylan do book reviews is just awesome all by itself. But the biggest reason why I suggest reading it first is it'll give you a good sense of Dylan's voice and how he speaks and his rhythm and tempo of how he reads and how he writes and how he talks. And when I started reading this book, I just kind of instantly slipped into that pattern as though Dylan was reading it to me. And it just really made the words come alive even more, to actually read them as though he was saying them, because I've been listening to him since I was born, so I'm very familiar with those patterns and how he talks. And it really does make his written word come alive even more to read it in that voice, because it just flows so natural when you do that. And on a side note, this was a book I read for Nonfiction November this year. And I also read Samuel R. Delany's memoir, The Motion of Light and Water, Sex and Science Fiction Writing in the East Village. And that was also set in 1961. So it was nice to read Delany's memoir in the East Village in 61, and then Dylan's memoir in the West Village in 1961. So one of my favorite science fiction authors and my favorite lyricist, songwriter, were both in New York City, in the Village, in 1961 at the same time, in the 2 very different worlds of East and West Village. And Dylan actually makes a brief appearance in Delany's memoir, because Delany, besides being a writer, he played guitar, and from time to time he performed with a little ensemble group here and there, and friends of his owned Cafe Wah over here in the West Village. And he would go over there and just play sometimes. And he was set to play there, and there was a little note about some kid named Bob Dylan who was going to play also. But Delany and his group were going to be the main people playing, and then Dylan could come on afterwards. And Dylan kind of steamrolls into the club, goes right up on stage, sits down, pulls his guitar up, and starts playing. And then the owner's like, no, you can't go. It's not your turn. You got to wait. And Dylan was basically like, I have no time for this. I got to perform now. And they're like, you can't. So Dylan's like, yep, packs his stuff up, and out the door he goes, stops outside, takes his little name tag off the little placard on the street, and down he goes off the street. And that's the only kind of mention of Dylan, and it's like they didn't know each other or interact with each other. But it was fun to read that memoir first, see that little snippet, and then to read Dylan's memoir of what Dylan was up to and what he was doing. And you see that the pattern was like you'd come to the city, you'd go down to McDougal Street, and then you'd hustle your ass off. And you'd sing in a coffee shop in the middle of the day. You'd sing a couple of songs just to be able to play, just to keep practicing, keep playing, start getting your name out there, getting noticed. And then eventually, and you play it anywhere you can play, a coffee shop, doesn't matter, in the corner somewhere, wherever. And you eventually get noticed to the point where you get to play in those same places, but later in the day. And then eventually at night, headlining in a smaller coffee shop or a smaller club. And the goal is to work your way all the way around that whole scene till you can get to the Gaslight. And then the Gaslight is where you can really begin to start making a name for yourself. And the ultimate goal, however, is to get to Gertie's Folk City, because that was the premier place. If you made it to Gertie's Folk City and performed at night on the main stage, on the stage there, for the main crowd at night, that's when you were becoming someone in the folk scene. And this book follows Dylan's kind of everything he was up to and all the people he was meeting and who he wanted to meet and what he had to do to make sure he could meet them, and then just still absorbing music and discovering new songs and just diving into them. And all of this was before Dylan started writing songs himself. He wasn't interested in being a songwriter when he came to New York City. He was interested in performing all of this fantastic music, this Americana music, and emulating all these, to him, who are just the best musicians and singers and songwriters that lived. And he had no thoughts of writing his own songs. And what the book does then is it jumps up forward all the way to 1989. And there's like an interlude section where he goes into pretty in-depth detail about working with producer Daniel Lanois on his album No Mercy in 1989. And it's just kind of a whole aside. And but he works through that whole process and what the two of them were like and how they differed and butted heads and how they eventually figured out how to work with each other and come up with this album. Which, while it wasn't considered a great album in Dylan's catalog, Dylan really enjoys it and likes the album a lot and liked what they were able to accomplish and how much they were able to accomplish considering how much they clashed in the beginning. But both men could see that both were kind of geniuses in their own way when it came to music. They just came at things from a completely different way, and it took them a while to work together. And then he returns back to 1961 to take you through realizing he had to start writing his own songs. And then the events that kind of pushed him forward and led up to him becoming the songwriter he eventually became. And there's one performance he sees of a particular woman singing a particular song on stage down in the village somewhere. And that was like the moment, the catalyst, wherein he realized how powerful it was to come up with your own stuff. And that's really where the songwriter Dylan, the lyricist Dylan, was born in that moment. And he looks back on it and wonders, would I have become the songwriter I became had I not, just by chance, decided to go to that one show and see this one performance? And again, just an absolutely wonderful, wonderful memoir. Again, I'm from New York City, so it's my home, getting to see my home in this much detail. Before I was old enough to go down there and hang out, and just, again, growing up with his music and getting to see his journey of becoming Dylan, really cool. And he even goes into his Robert Zimmerman's his real name and how he ended up with the name Bob Dylan and why. Really interesting stuff, little tidbits like that. And one thing you could probably do, and I'm going to have to do when I do a reread of this at some point. I started doing it in the beginning, but I realized it would just take way too long to work through the book. But I highly recommend you do it if you're interested. Is Dylan takes the time to talk about the early folk singers and blues singers and who were such big influential people on him and his style as a singer and guitar player. And he gives you their names and even sometimes certain songs that would just shift his whole mindset, where something would click into place when he heard this one person singing this one song. And he tells you what each of those are. So when I was in pretty much the first section of the book, I was stopping at each point. He would mention somebody and go to YouTube and pull them up and listen to them. Or if he mentioned a specific song sung by a specific folk artist, I would stop and listen to them. And that's another thing I think that would really enhance the experience of this book as well. If you're not as familiar with folk music, particularly early folk music that Dylan was just completely obsessed and immersed in, to take that moment and listen and hear the exact song, the exact recording that Dylan is talking about, discovering in this book, I think is just, it's one of the beauties of the internet now is you can turn reading a book into a multimedia experience because it happens to be about music and about songs. And all these songs are now available at your fingertips online. So I would definitely recommend that if you're not in a rush to read this. I ended up reading it in 2 sittings. So I loved it so much I couldn't put it down and couldn't stop reading it. But I am going to have to come back to this at some point in the future and work my way slowly through it and just listen to each and every artist that he mentions and each specific song that he mentions when he mentions them in the book. Because I think it'll be added just a whole new layer of enjoyment to the story from what I already had in just reading it in general and reading it in Dylan's voice. And that's pretty much it. I'm just going to wrap this up here. Again, I'd also recommend The Motion of Light and Water by Samuel R. Delany. I will link that up here. That's my other book review I did from my other book I read during Nonfiction November. I have this here too. It was coincidence when I put them on my Nonfiction November list that they both took place in the Village in 1961. And once I realized what they both did, I knew I had to read them back to back. And I was glad I started with Delany's first and then read Dylan's, especially because Dylan appears for like half a second in Delany's memoir. So it was a nice little like teaser for what I was going to then read in detail in here. But anyway, excellent book. New York City, 1961, the folk scene, what it was like, what MacDougal Street was like. Here's the back picture of a very young Dylan. And I think this is pretty much an old Times Square picture from the looks of it, even not the Village, but it's a pretty cool shot of New York City, which New York City photography and Dylan are iconic. They go together. Some of Dylan's early albums are pictures of him walking down a New York City street. So not surprising since it takes place mostly in the city that even though it's not the Village, it's at least New York. And I'm going to wrap this up here. Again, highly recommend. Absolute 5-star read for me. But again, my experience was enhanced by having grown up to this man's music and considering him my favorite songwriter. I'm going to wrap it up here. This is Charles of SirBookSage. Happy reading.